Well, good morning and evening, depending on where we are in the world these days. I'm Dr. Heather Herdman. I apologize for my voice. I'm kind of have a little bit of a cold here. Um, Dr. Shigemi Kamitsuru is with us from Tokyo, and Dr. Camila Takao Lopez is with us as well from Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I'm in the United States. We're going to ask that you use the chat feature to ask questions or to pose, if you have comments that would be helpful for us. And our program administrator from Boston College, Melissa Ayala, will be watching that and keeping track of that so that when we're done with our presentation, she can let us know what your questions are or what your comments are. So it's lovely to see everybody here, but please use that chat feature for questions and for comments now so that we can kind of keep track of those. So this is the first in our series of seminars that NANDA is going to be producing. And so we're really excited that we're starting to move in this direction. And we are starting by talking about things in the new textbook. I know that we have our publications out now in 16 languages, and there are 5 more that are in process and 2 more contracts that are in process. So we will have the most translations ever this year. So we're very excited about that. The most recent one that came out is the German translation, which I believe was just received last week, is what Claudia told us yesterday. So that's exciting. And there are several more coming along. So we'll start by just kind of going through some of the things that are in the new book, and then we do welcome your questions and comments at the end. So you want to go ahead, Camila? Okay, so just basically here, this is our table of contents, and as you can see by the little new logos there, we have quite a bit of new content that is in this textbook today. We did revise part 1, which is the information, the chapters on the diagnosis, on assessment. We put in new information regarding where we see research priorities for nursing diagnosis and for the classification itself. Specifically looking at what diagnoses still need to be refined and where we have gaps, where we have classes that have no diagnoses at all, that we feel we should have diagnoses for. One of the most exciting, I think, parts of the introduction, or maybe the most exciting parts of the introductory material, is part 4, which is the revised level of evidence criteria. I'm really excited with this. We had 3 professors, excuse me, from Brazil that we worked with, or we asked to take on this project, and they have really moved this level of evidence criteria into the 21st century. And what I really love about this chapter, even though it's a difficult chapter to read, I'm going to be honest, but what is really lovely about it is it gives very clear examples of the type of research study that we're looking for to help move diagnoses through that level of evidence to a higher and higher level. And so you will see examples of research articles that have been published related to nursing diagnoses that are used for that level of evidence criteria. And Camila is going to go through that later in more detail. So that's great. We have added in to this edition, or back into this edition, Shigemi's tripartite model of nursing practice, which has become a staple in my teaching. I know I find it incredibly helpful to help students understand nursing practice and when we need a nursing diagnosis and when we don't need a nursing diagnosis. So I encourage you to really look at that if you haven't seen that. And then, of course, we just looked at international implications of the terminology, looking at how nursing education around the globe is taking place, how nursing diagnoses are used in different classifications, et cetera. And then the clinical reasoning chapter is also updated with some more information there too. So quite a lot of new information. If you have your books and haven't had a chance to go through them, I encourage you not to just look at the classification, but to look at the stuff in the front, because I think the front matter is very helpful, especially for teaching. So moving on, we have also new information in terms of the axes. And we have a section on further development using the axes, and you may have seen on our website, you will be seeing in our blogs and in our newsletter, for those of you who are members, that we're having a lot of conversation around the use of axes. And Dr. Silvia Caldeira from Portugal is leading a lot of that conversation. But we are having conversation in terms of how many of those axes should we be using within our diagnostic labels, but also how do we use those axes? So there is conversation in terms of how granular do those axes, the use of those axes have to be within the label. So stay tuned for that. We're going to be asking you for some feedback on that. So we would love to have your impressions about that as well. You want to go ahead, Camila? Okay, so in the book itself, what do we have that's new? You will see that there's been a lot of work being done by the Diagnosis Development Task Force. Again, looking to strengthen the level of evidence of these diagnoses. So there's a lot of work that goes on in the background that you don't probably see when you see a textbook. But if you're looking at the database, if you happen to be on the electronic health record side of receiving the classification into a healthcare system or into a computer system, you will probably notice a lot of changes. One is that as we deal with translations around the world, we realize that English is not always the most clear language, and it's difficult sometimes to translate. I'm always struck by a meeting we had with the German-speaking group years ago, and somebody asked me, when we said lack of something, if I meant we didn't have any or we just didn't have enough. And my response to that was, yes, I mean both of those things. And the response was, that's impossible in German. We have to have one or the other. And so over the years, we have been consistently trying to work to improve the clarity of English, since that's our primary language, to make it better for you to translate into other languages. So one of the new things we did in this edition is that we started to use medical subject headings from the National Library of Medicine wherever possible to help standardize definitions of words. So while you don't see those, the translators who are working, when they get our database, see the NANDA term, but then they, if it's possible, they will see a mesh term, which comes with a definition, so that it helps to define what it is the English is trying to say. And personally, as the person who manages the translations and manages the reviews of those translations, I've had a lot of comments from translators that this was very helpful in their understanding of what it was NANDA was trying to say, or that the English was trying to say. As I mentioned, we revised the level of evidence criteria. And you will notice that in the label itself in the book, we have moved away from highlighting the diagnostic focus within the label. And we've moved it underneath that label to say what the focus is. And again, this is because it sometimes is awkward in the English, but it's often awkward in other languages because the diagnostic focus may be split up depending on how words are written in different languages. And so it made it difficult to kind of get a sense of the concept. So we just stopped doing that and moved it below the diagnostic label so that it's very clear what the focus is. So as you can see, we've continued to increase the number of diagnoses within the terminology. We moved from 244 in our 2018 edition to 267 in our 21 edition. And that's actually a net increase because we lost some as well. So we actually gained more than it actually looks like there. So you can see here, we had submissions come in from 12 different countries, and 46 were new diagnoses that were accepted. We had 67 revised diagnoses. This is huge. 23 retired diagnoses and 17 label changes. So I'll talk about each one of those individually to kind of give you a sense of why some of those things happened and what took place to make that happen. But we were really excited to have 12 different countries represented in terms of submissions this year. That's wonderful. So this is just an example of some of the diagnoses that we have added in different domains here to give you a sense. They're across most of the terminology, most of the classification. We have new additions in many of those domains, so we were excited about that as well. Go ahead. And we have changed labels. So in this case, you can see here some of the ones that we have changed, and I'm going to pick a few of them. So for example, we have under the safety protection domain, we originally had risk for suicide. Now, when you're thinking about what is the concept of interest here, it's kind of odd to say that the concept of interest is suicide. I mean, obviously, suicide is an endpoint, right? So it's not that nurses are concerned with the concept of interest of suicide, but rather they're interested in suicidal behaviors or suicidal ideation of the clients that we care for. So in this case, the label was changed to reflect what the human response actually is, which are these suicidal behaviors versus the endpoint, which would be suicide. So you'll see changes like that throughout the terminology. Higher up on that same chart on the right-hand side, you'll see bowel incontinence. And we have now changed this over to impaired bowel continence. Now, for those of you who are English speakers, you may say, well, that's awkward. That's kind of a weird way of saying that. And it is a little bit strange, but again, this goes back to our axis structure. And so we need to have a focus and we need to have a judgment. And in bowel incontinence, there's an implied judgment, incontinence, but there isn't a clear one. And so by having impaired bowel continence, we make it very clear that we are focused on bowel continence and that the judgment is that that is impaired. So you will see some changes in labels that have to do with either working within our multi-axial structure, or in some cases, the literature has changed. And so they may be older labels, and we have realized as Dr. Takao has worked with her group of clinical experts, and I have to say she has engaged the largest group of clinical experts we have ever had from around the globe, many of whom are not NANDA members, but actually were content experts who had been had published in these areas that she reached out to and asked for support. And we were really excited with the amount of people who were really happy to work with us. And we learned through those content experts' work that some of the terms we were using had changed, and they were no longer clinically valid or even valid in the research literature anymore. And so those terms also were changed for those reasons. So here we have some of the, I'm trying to see, I just lost the, I don't see the slide. It just disappeared on me.
It's the revised diagnosis. I think there's a lag between changing the slide and you seeing.
Yep, there it is. Yep, there it is. Thank you. It just took it a minute to show up. So these are the revised labels. Camila, is that correct? Because I just lost, it just went away again. I don't know if my connection isn't stable.
I'm sorry, it is in the 67 revised diagnosis slide. Is it showing to you?
Yeah, no, it keeps going in and out. So these are just other examples then. Do you want to move on to the next one?
Okay.
The revisions, I think the revisions, you will see that we had, as Camila said, 67 revisions. And again, she pulled together teams of clinical experts in each of these areas. So she went to the literature, identified people who were publishing in these areas, and then asked them to join us and to help us to revise these diagnoses. And so we have significant levels of research, systemic reviews on some things, and you will notice that the level of evidence will increase in some of these diagnoses because of, from what they had been previously, because these individuals were able to identify for us, here's the research, and here's what you need to know about this stuff. And so many of the diagnoses are significantly changed. And then some of them just have some changes. But what I think is really, really important is this was the first time that we had a really clear systematic review of these diagnoses by groups of individuals outside and inside NANDA International, to ensure that the diagnostic criteria that we are identifying as related factors or risk factors, defining characteristics, were in fact what is found in the current state of the art of the literature. So I think that Camila's team did an incredible amount of work here, and we really owe them a huge debt of gratitude. So now we're looking at terms that we have replaced and retired. And why have we retired diagnoses? And I get questions all the time asking me, why did you take away my I use this diagnosis all the time. Why did you take it away? Or they don't realize that one term was exchanged for a different term. But there were three main reasons why we retired diagnoses in this edition. The first was, as I just mentioned, research. If we found research that suggested that our previous terms were outdated, or they had been replaced, or they were being defined in a way that was completely different than how we had used them in the past, the protocol for terminology is to retire those terms and then to have a new term if that's relative. If you need a new term, then you develop a new term. So anytime a definition changes in our terminology, we retire that diagnosis, unless it's an editorial change. But if it's a content change of a definition, we retire that diagnosis, and then we add a new diagnosis. So you will see some of that. In many of the cases, what we found was that there were no related factors that were actually modifiable by independent nursing intervention. So here is an example of when I will get comments from nurses, and they'll say, oh, but I use that diagnosis all the time. And then when they say to them, well, what is it that you as a nurse do for that diagnosis? The response is usually, I monitor them and I refer, right? So we have always said that if the only reason, or the only thing that we can do independently as nurses is either monitor or refer, then we're not looking at a nursing diagnosis. It does not mean that nurses don't do things. It doesn't mean that there aren't interventions that are important to nursing. But it means that the basis for those interventions is not nursing knowledge, but rather medical knowledge or knowledge from a different discipline or protocol from a hospital, for example. Those things do not need nursing diagnoses. We certainly do not want to get into the practice of renaming medical diagnoses. And so we very carefully looked at diagnoses, and if the related factors were not modifiable by independent intervention, the diagnoses were removed. And then finally, there were times when the diagnosis itself did not meet the definition of a problem-focused diagnosis. So for example, grieving was one of our problem-focused diagnoses. And yet we all, I think, would agree, and certainly the literature would suggest, that grieving is a normal human response. It is not a problem. It is normal, right? So we have changed the way that we are looking at grieving within the classification. And then, so in order to do that, we've retired the diagnosis of grieving, and we now have a new diagnosis that addresses grieving in a different way. So those are just some of the examples of that. And so finally, I think we talked about the mesh terms here, and these are just some examples of phrases. And you will see, for example, that insufficient support system is a phrase that is used in multiple diagnoses. You can see some of them here. And when we looked at the mesh term, we found that the actual term is social support as opposed to a support system. And so we changed those phrases to reflect the mesh term, because that allows us to then give that definition of social support to our translators. So all of the terms in the terminology, in the classification now, are coded. They have been for a while, but every edition, we are getting better and better about reducing duplication and refining those terms, so that when people get these into their electronic health record systems, it's very clearly coded, and they can identify them. If they have an electronic assessment, for example, they can identify assessment terms that link to our diagnostic criteria, which can be helpful down the road if they start to build some decision support tools. Inadequate social support is in 22 diagnoses. I think there were 7 or 8 different ways that we addressed social support in these 22 diagnoses. So the phrases were just a little bit different in some of those diagnoses. Now they are identical across those 22 diagnoses. What that means there's benefits to that for a lot of reasons. One is it helps with research. So if somebody's looking for a particular thing, so if they want to know, let's say, what the diagnostic criteria are for the diagnosis hopelessness, for example, they will find inadequate social support in there. And then they can also look to see, well, what other diagnoses have that same diagnostic criteria, and should I be considering those other diagnoses? Should I, broaden my research to look at not only hopelessness, but maybe, I don't know, chronic low self-esteem? And it will help us to kind of follow how people are getting from assessment to diagnosis, which of the phrases are being used when we are diagnosing, so that will help us as we can work on education and on research. Secondly, it really helps with translation. So when translators see a system in a computerized system and they only have to translate that term one time, and then it just automatically populates all the other diagnoses where that term exists, it makes their work much easier, rather than having to go through and remember, what did I call that term the last time that I translated it? So that's important. And again, when possible, as in this case, we do try to associate it with the mesh concept. So when you see on the left-hand side, you see what is in our database. So you will notice that loneliness and inadequate social support have mesh terms identified with them, and we give the mesh term and the code for that. And it's actually set up so that if they hover over that, they can actually see the definition. But when you see it in the printed version, you don't see that. that term. So there is a difference in what happens in the database and in the text. And now Camila is going to start to talk to you about level of evidence.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. We're moving on to know a little bit more about the revised level of evidence criteria, that exciting chapter 4 of our book. Having some trouble moving on with the slides. Okay, so these are our 3 authors of this chapter: Professor Marcos Vinicius Lopes, Professor Viviane Silva, and Professor Dina Cruz. Professors Marcos and Viviane are from the Federal University of Ceará in Brazil, and Professor Dina Cruz, who we have the honor to have with us today, is a professor at the São Paulo University, or USP, also in Brazil. And we will find in this chapter that understanding where to start or how to do validation studies for diagnosis has become more easy. And when I look at a diagnosis and I have an interest about that concept, I can look at its current level of evidence and then look at this table now and think, well, does it have is the concept clear? Are there enough elements to this diagnostic structure? Does it already have any theoretical support based on expert opinion? Does it have any kind of clinical validity studies that have been published? But if it does, in which population was this diagnosis studied, and at which level, which evidence of clinical validity was obtained for this diagnosis for a specific population? So I'm going to go through a little bit about these elements in this table for you. First, the first thing that is really important is the understanding of what validity is for a diagnosis. Now we are looking now at an accumulation of evidence to support this diagnosis, either empirical evidence or theoretical evidence, or the constructor of theories to support that label, to support that definition, to support that a given set of defining characteristics really represent that diagnosis, to support that those etiological factors really increase the chance or increase the risk of someone presenting that concept of interest. So this is how we understand validity now. So I might have a diagnosis in our classification that has been approved. There is theoretical evidence to support it. And then I am interested in understanding how it happens in a certain population. And my colleague, another researcher, might be interested in understanding how it happens in another population. We have that opportunity now to accumulate evidence in different settings of those specific indicators, those specific etiological factors for each of our diagnoses. And of course, we have the opportunity to develop new diagnostic proposals and have evidence of clinical validity in different clinical settings later. So we're going to start with concept generation, and then we're going to move to theoretical support and then clinical support. And you will find in the chapter that every step of the way there is a hint or there is explanation on which types of studies we might want to use to obtain those kind of evidence to support our diagnosis. So I might have an idea, I might look at my clinical practice and think that, well, I see this in my clinical practice every day. I think this is a human response. I think this is a nursing diagnosis that could be included in the NANDA classification, and we don't have that yet. So this is where I'm going to start. I'm going to start generating the concept. I'm going to look at my clinical practice, and I'm going to find support in the literature to each of my elements. Do I have literature support to this label? Do I have literature support to this definition? Do I have literature support to each defining characteristic? Do I have literature support to each related factor or risk factor for this proposal? This is an initial step of diagnosis development, and this kind of proposal will not yet be included in the book. And I'm going to show you later where we might have these initial structures of diagnosis, where I only have literature support to each element. And then when I have this initial structure, I can move on to theoretical support, to obtaining evidence of theoretical support to this specific structure. So I might want, for example, to do a concept analysis. I will go to the literature and I will understand what happens before, what are the antecedent elements, what happens later or after the concept happens, what are the defining characteristics, what are the essential attributes that I should show in my definition to reflect my label. So this is one type of study, a concept analysis, that will produce evidence of conceptual validity. But I also might want to get this antecedent and consequent and critical attribute elements and provide a theoretical structure or create a theoretical structure showing that, for example, some of these antecedent elements or ideological factors, they make a person more prone to develop a given concept, or they reinforce another stimulus that I had before, and then the person develops the human response. I will build theoretical observations about the relationships of those concepts. I am still producing evidence of conceptual validity with a different type of study that would be a study of constructing middle range theories, for example. Still inside this level of theoretical support, once I have the structure that I built here, and then I have conceptual validity evidence that I built here through different types of studies, I might want to submit this structure to the opinion of specialists. And then I might have a little number of specialists with a lot of expertise, or I might have a lot of experts, but they only have a little expertise. So we will see, you will see when you read this chapter that these levels represent both the number of experts that I have available and their level of expertise. And depending on that balance, I will produce different sub-levels of diagnostic content validity. So once we have theoretical support to that diagnostic structure, it is able to be in our textbook, and we will see it there. And then once we have that structure approved and published by NANDA, we will look for clinical support in different clinical settings. So I might want to go to a given population, a population of interest, and ask them about their perceptions of that human response, how they perceive them. So I will be obtaining evidence of qualitative validity. Or I might want to look at the defining characteristics and study this diagnosis in a given population and understand how sensitive the defining characteristics are, how specific the defining characteristics are. If I do these types of studies, it might be a cross-sectional study, for example, I will be obtaining evidence of clinical construct validity. I might also want to understand which defining characteristics along the time tell me that the diagnosis is happening, or that the patient has unexpected or unwanted outcomes related to the diagnosis. So I'll be producing evidence of prognostic validity to that diagnostic structure. So there are different types of studies to produce evidence of clinical validity regarding our defining characteristics, our clinical evidence, or our clinical indicators. But I also might be interested in understanding the causal relationships between the related factors or the risk factors and my diagnosis of interest. So I might have a case control study or a prospective cohort study to understand which related factors or which risk factors are really linked to the occurrence of a given set of defining characteristics. When they are present, they increase the risk of a diagnosis happening. And then I will be obtaining, for example, evidence of diagnosis-specific causal validity. So for each level and sub-level of diagnostic validity, you will find in this amazing chapter examples of studies that have already done it. When you look at these more elevated levels, you will see that the authors told us, to this date, there are no studies representing this level of evidence. And then once the book was published, someone in the world published a systematic review producing evidence of generalized validity of the related factors of ineffective health self-management. So even after the book was published and we have this chapter out, we are constantly receiving evidence produced by our excellent nurse researchers around the world. So this is I love this chapter. This is a very exciting chapter, and I hope everyone appreciates it as much as we did. So this is just a summary trying to show you that we have early stages of development, and we still won't have the structure in our classification in our textbook. And once we obtain theoretical support and clinical support to this diagnosis, we might have it approved and included in our classification. Having theoretical support is enough to have a diagnosis included in the textbook, but to keep it in the textbook in the future, we hope we will have evidence of clinical validity in different settings submitted to the Diagnosis Development Committee. And then finally, on the differences that we have now for our diagnostic foci, you will see in our previous edition that we had the diagnostic focus in bold letters here in the label. And Heather explained to us that this was troublesome to some translations. So in Brazil, for example, we had to split the focus, and then we have a part of the focus, we had the judgment, and then we had the second part of the focus. This was confusing. So right now what we have in the 2021 edition is the focus of the diagnosis showing below the diagnostic label, and we also have our specific table of showing all of our diagnoses, and we have a column showing the foci of the diagnosis alone. I think I have a table here. Yeah. So for risk for elopement attempt, we can see here on this side that elopement attempt is actually the focus of the diagnosis. And finally, talking a little bit about the research priorities, which is a new chapter in the book. We chose to show or to discuss with you today what we call a retirement list. You saw in the previous edition that some diagnoses showed a little message below saying that there was no evidence of related factors, there was no evidence of risk factors, that diagnosis did not have an assigned level of evidence, and that it might be removed in the next edition. We worked with a lot of those diagnoses. Some were retired and some were kept in the classification and of course updated, but we still have some diagnoses that have no level of evidence. We still have diagnoses with no related factors or risk factors, meaning that it was not shown to us that there are factors that nurses can treat independently. And we also have syndrome diagnoses, whose defining characteristics are not other NANDA-I diagnoses. Therefore, their structure is not in agreement with the way we define a nursing diagnosis syndrome. This is our list of 32 diagnoses with no level of evidence right now. So we really expect to receive evidence that these diagnoses, these clinical indicators are present in a given population, or evidence with theoretical support, so that we can keep this diagnosis in our classification. So this is our priority right now. This is what we are working with the DDC. We are doing literature research while we don't receive from submitters, to understand if these are really human responses, if there's really a level of evidence and literature support or clinical support to keep them in our classification. And then, okay, and then we have 2 diagnoses with no related factors. We have 3 diagnoses with risk factors. Again, we want to be shown that there are factors, there are elements that nurses do treat independently in the interdisciplinary context. And we also have post-trauma syndrome and risk for post-trauma syndrome, whose defining characteristics are not other NANDA-I diagnoses. So we are also focusing on working with this diagnosis. We do have a submission for revision of this diagnosis, and we'll see if we'll manage to keep it in the classification based on that evidence. We want to invite you all to visit our website, and we just wanted to show you a few things that we have there right now. In the latest news tab, you will find blog posts from different members of the NANDA-I board. We try to do that weekly or every 15 days to have you updated and to have your concerns, to communicate with you. And here are just 2 examples. If you want to follow the QR codes, here is a post with a question that Heather receives all the time. Where is the NANDA-I diagnostic list? So you'll see her comments and her responses there. And here is a post on what are the nursing diagnoses for AIDS, or what are the nursing diagnoses actually for any given medical diagnosis. This is the type of questions that we receive, and we thought it would be interesting to have public responses there. So we invite you all to go to our latest news and communicate with us and know what's happening with NANDA-I. And inside the tab of publications and resources, we also want to highlight here the NANDA-I Research Registry. This is also new. It was created by our research committee, and there, whoever's doing research or whoever's planning research with nursing diagnosis can share it with our members, share it with other researchers in the world. We do not mean to evaluate, to give opinions. We just want to facilitate communication between researchers and facilitate networking between researchers. So this is an opportunity to show the world which diagnosis we are working with, build relationships, have research partnerships. This is the intention of the NANDA-I Research Registry, or the NANDA-I R2 is an interesting name that we're using to call it. And then we also want to show you, I'm sorry, here, inside educational offerings, you will find, in addition to our seminars, news on the conference, the NANDA-I conference, courses that are available in different languages. We have a nursing diagnosis basic course right now with actors. It is a very interesting course in different languages available. And please let us know if you have any doubts. Thank you very much for your attention and for attending and being here with us.